This week, I sit down with Jim Edlund, and we talk about river fishing from shore, maximizing your time on the water, vertical jigging for walleyes, and lipless crankbaits. Hello and welcome to Ask the Buzz, the show where you send us your fishing questions and we answer them. I'm Nick Linder, and this week I have with me Jim Edlund.
Nice to see you, Nick.
Nice to see you as well. Jim is a great writer, and you've probably, a great fishing writer, I should say, and you've probably seen a lot of his work in a lot of different publications, and he works with a lot of different manufacturers, so we're very, very excited to have you on.
Thanks again.
And Jim has a great depth of knowledge in, I would, you fish for a lot of different species, correct?
Whatever the bite is.
Whatever the bite is, I'm with you there. And so I picked out some questions that I thought Jim would do a really good job of answering. A few questions that you guys have sent in. So without further ado, let's jump right in.
All right.
So the first question is from Camden Glade. And Camden asks, for someone without access to a boat, what is the best way to find productive spots to fish on mid-sized rivers in the spring and fall?
Good question, Camden. I've spent a lot of time over the years fishing from shore. Bank fishing can be very productive, especially in the seasons that you mentioned, spring and fall. There are a few things you can do to scout these areas before you even set foot, near the water. One is using Google Earth, whether it's on your laptop or on your phone. You can get a bird's eye view of how these river systems are laid out. You can find easements. You can find high probability areas where water is flowing in, oxbows, islands, tail races, dams, and you can do this all from home before you even get down to the river. There are also phone apps like the USGS has a website, and there's some apps out there that'll tell you the amount of flow at that given time, because one of the big factors is finding out if it's high water, low water, or normal pool level, because these are the factors that are going to give you an indication of the best spots to fish, even if you're fishing from shore. Now, high water is a bank angler's best friend in a lot of ways, because high water pushes fish, for the most part, closer to the shore. In those situations, finding areas of riprap, eddies, and tail race areas, anywhere water is entering the larger river system, like a feeder creek. Don't overlook storm drains, sewers, and the like, where water is coming in. These can be all great areas in spring and in fall. During normal pool or low water times, you're still looking for eddies and current breaks and current seams, but the fish are going to be more out towards holes. You can still look out, for an eddy in front of the tail race. A washout hole is a good place to start if you can make long casts. Sure. These are all things to look for. Areas of riprap. So really, as far as being a shore angler, in spring and fall, you aren't really limited not having a boat. In fact, there are times when being a bank fisherman puts the odds in your favor, especially fishing at night. Once you get used to an area, fishing at night is a good call. Especially around wing dams, you'll get fish that move up at night. In high water, you're going to have those fish behind the wing dam. In low water, you're going to have them more towards the tip and in the front. But there are a lot of things you can do as a shore angler. Get yourself a pair of waders. It's really a boat you can wear.
Right.
But get familiar with the body of water first. So those are just a few things to keep in mind when fishing a river system.
That's some really good stuff. So now my question for you, what is your number one favorite shore river bite?
My favorite is probably during high water, in evening, in the spring, when you get fish that actually push up into feeder creeks that are chasing bait. I've been on some bites over the years where you can catch walleyes, you can catch other species. That's a great thing about rivers, is you never know what you're going to catch. But finding those fish that are pushing bait fish up into other, smaller creeks and in the backwaters, that can be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Right on. Well, we will jump into question number 2. And the next question is from Zach Heidman. And Zach asks, for the average fisherman, what are some keys to using a fish finder and to maximize your time on the water?
Good question. Again, with fish finders, I think one of the most important things to consider is proper installation. It all starts, he wants to maximize his time on the water, and a way to do that is to have error-free operation. So as you're installing your fish finder, you want to make sure that your power cable, you're using something like 18 gauge copper stranded wire to connect it to your battery. You're using an inline fuse, whatever the manufacturer recommends. It might be 1 amp, 3 amp, 6.3 amp. And that's really to prevent anything from happening to your fish finder. And along those lines, making sure that you start up your fish finders after you turn on the big motor. Along with installation is proper transducer installation. So on the transom of the boat, making sure that you orient that transducer so that it's free of turbulence. So when you look down the back of your boat, you've got ribs and strakes. You really want it along a smooth area so you're not getting a lot of turbulence, either from that as when the boat's moving or from the lower unit. And along the same lines, you want that transducer to be looking down, not this way, angled too far up, or this way, angled too far down. It's called cavitation. So you want to make sure that you have proper installation of both your unit with power, the transducer, and after that, it's really not deviating too much from the factory default settings. A lot of guys immediately go in and start changing everything.
Sure.
But the factory default settings are there for a reason. Go to a body of water that you're familiar with, where you know there's a sunken island here, there's a weed line here, there's a bottom transition here, and start looking at what's on your screen. This will give you a good indication of how to read and interpret your fish finder when you go to a new body of water. So those are some things that you can do to get more acquainted, and to maximize your time on the water.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Well, let's jump into question number 3. And this question is from Brad Nosich. Brad asks, when vertically jigging in current for walleyes, what type of jigging cadence do you generally like using?
That's a really good question. Recently, I was down in Red Wing, fishing walleyes and saugers, and we did a fair amount of pitching plastics in shallow water along riprap for bigger fish, but we did push up closer to the dam, and we were vertical jigging. And this situation was a lot like others. It really proves that with vertical jigging and current, the devil's in the details. I had a couple friends with, one who's a very accomplished vertical jig fisherman, and he carries probably half a dozen jigging rods, and then a separate case of just filler spools, all labeled with different line types and different line tests. He was catching a lot more fish than we were, and so I started watching him. I'm back at the tiller, he's next to me. I was watching his cadence, I was watching his rod angle, and then I was looking at the particulars of the weight of his jig, the color of his jig, etc. You really have to let the fish help you decide, okay? So sometimes it's a pop or a rip. Sometimes it's a twitch, 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 micro movements. Sometimes it's almost dead sticking. Starting with the lightest jig that you can use to maintain bottom contact is what I always do. But there are a lot of other factors that go along with the cadence. The one that I mentioned is line choice. Mm-hmm. There were some of us that were fishing, Superline and fluoro, then I had another rod with 6-pound mono, and the system that ended up working the best was 8-pound mono, 3/8 ounce fireball jig head in bubble gum with a stinger hook, and his rod angle was slightly off vertical, but he was still maintaining bottom contact, and he was just getting bit a lot more. The funny thing about it is he was jigging with his left hand, and I knew he was a right-handed. I said, do you always jig with your left hand? He goes, well, I can do both. And so he was doing a lift drag with his left hand, and it wasn't quite vertical. He had 8-pound monofilament. We were doing something else. We switched, and we discovered, what the system was. And it was cadence, color, weight, angle of the rod, and line test. It was all of those things.
Really?
So really, you've got to experiment. That's a great question. And it changes from day to day. On the river, the fish might be here today, gone tomorrow. They might bite this today, and they might not tomorrow.
Well, that's what makes fishing so crazy and difficult is that it's very rare that you can find something that'll work, for that whole week or even 2 days in a row. Everything's changing, and it's quite a bit of work to keep up with all of it if you're trying to stay on the bite.
Absolutely. And and being mindful of those nuances and having everybody in the boat trying something different, whether it's a color, a jig weight, a line type, sooner or later somebody's going to be successful, and then the rest of you could follow.
Right on. Well, I think we have time for at least one more question here.
Okay.
So we will do this question here from Charles Hollingsworth. And Charles asks, I like to fish a 3/8 ounce lipless crankbait for bass. The bigger fish tend to throw the bait when they're jumping out of the water. What is the best line to use, and should I change to a larger hook on the rear of the bait?
Wow, again, that's a great question. Charles, you're not alone with this issue. In fact, even pro bass anglers talk about how hard it is to keep bass buttoned on a lipless crankbait, some of the top anglers in the world. Because you're using a 3/8 ounce lipless, I'm going to guess you're fishing deeper water. What type of line? There are a couple different schools of thought. You've got guys who fish super lines, some fish fluoro, some fish monofilament, but it's about matching the line to the rod action. So, for example, if you're using a super line which doesn't have a lot of stress, you should be using a rod with a more parabolic, moderate action that introduces some flex into the system to make sure that fish can move and you aren't ripping hooks out of the fish. Conversely, if you're using monofilament, you want a rod with a faster action, in the upper 1/3 of the rod, so just more of the tip section is moving to compensate for the stretch in the monofilament. So is there a right line? Well, it's about matching either of those two line types, or 3 counting fluoro, which doesn't have a lot of stretch either, to the right rod action. As far as keeping hooks in those fish, a lot of guys have experimented with upping the size of the rear hook, sometimes cutting off one of the bends, removing the front hook. Because a lipless crankbait tends to run nose down, depending on how you're fishing it, whether it's vertically or casting it, it's that front hook that's usually, snagging most of the time. So you could upsize, that rear hook, or you can play around with some new stuff on the market. Like I know there are bass pros who are now using some hooks out of Japan called Quattros, made by a company called Decoy, and it has 4 bends instead of 3, so that you're getting more hook penetration. But really, I would look at the line and the rod action combination. And again, are you setting the hook? The tendency is to set the hook really hard when a fish hits it, but instead just leaning into that fish, almost like you're fishing a barbless hook, and maintaining the direction of that fish and reeling up your slack, making sure there's no slack in the system, and preventing that fish from turning its head. If you see the line climbing, to dip the nose of your rod down and just bring that fish in, in one direction without letting it go all over the place and potentially losing it.
Sure.
So,
so when I was younger, I was kind of taught that, if I'm fishing a tournament for bass, maybe try not to throw lipless crankbaits because they're sort of notorious for being thrown, when fish get excited. Do you think it's sort of, if you're throwing a lipless crankbait, maybe that just comes with the territory, you might lose a few more fish?
I think that's one of the issues. But there's some things that you can do. You can make sure your hooks are sharp. You can make sure that your drag set, right. You can watch how you're handling the fish and try to reduce the number of fish that are lost on a lipless crankbait, because there are situations when it's hard to beat a lipless crankbait. Cold water situations, its versatility throughout the entire water column, and from shallow to deep, vertical to long casts. I mean, just because you could lose a fish is no reason not to fish it when there are precautions you can take to try to keep those fish buttoned.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sometimes lipless crankbaits are the deal. So you got to do what you can do. But hey, I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Nick.
I thank you for your time and for your knowledge. And if there's is there anywhere online that somebody could find you, or anywhere they could find your writing?
Sure. I'm contributing occasionally to targetwalleye.com, some tips there. Also to the current ice guide, walleye guide, and some in-fish properties, and lots of other places too. So.
Right on. Well, until next week, you guys keep sending questions and we will keep answering them.